The 25th Voyage. One of the main space lanes in the constellation of the Great Bear connects the planets of Mufta and Taphedum. On the way it passes Tyia, a rocky sphere that enjoys the worst sort of reputation among travelers, and this on account of the swarms of boulders that surround it. That whole region presents a picture of primordial chaos and danger. The disk of the planet barely shows from behind those clouds of stone, in which you have incessant lightning and thunder from colliding chunks of rock. A few years ago, the pilots running flights between Taphedum and Mufta began to tell of certain dire monsters which would emerge suddenly from the whirling debris above Tyia and attack rockets, wrapping their long tentacles about them, attempting to pull them down into their murky layers. Some passengers had been badly frightened, but so far that was all. Then the news spread that monsters had attacked a traveler while he was taking an after-dinner stroll around his rocket in a spacesuit. This was greatly exaggerated, since the traveler in question, a good friend of mine, had spilled coffee on his spacesuit and hung it out the hatch to dry, when strange, writhing creatures flew up and made off with it. Finally, feelings ran so high on the neighboring planets that a special expedition was sent to comb the area around Tyia. Some of its members claimed that deep inside the clouds of Tyia they had spotted snake-like things resembling octopuses. This, however, was never verified, and after a month, the expedition, not daring to venture into the dark regions of Tyria's flint clouds, returned to Taphedum empty-handed. Other expeditions were undertaken later, but with no results. At last, a famous stellar adventurer, the intrepid Gorros, set out for Tyia, 2 hounds in spacesuits at his side, to hunt the enigmatic creatures. After 5 days, he returned alone, haggard and drawn. As he told it, not far from Tyia, a number of monsters had all at once come charging out from behind a nebula and wound him and his hounds in their tentacles. The brave hunter pulled out a knife and, hacking away blindly, succeeded in freeing himself from the deadly coils, to which, alas, his hounds succumbed. The spacesuit of Gorros bore, both inside and out, the signs of battle, and in several places green strands of some kind, almost like fibrous stems, were found clinging to it. The College of Sciences, having examined these vestiges minutely, announced that they were fragments of a multicellular organism well known on Earth, namely the Solanum tuberosum, a bulbaceous, gametopetalous, multiseminiferous species with individual pinatipartite segmentations, brought by the Spaniards from America to Europe in the 16th century. That news alone excited the imagination, but it is difficult to describe what took place after someone translated the scholarly explanation into everyday language, and it turned out that Gorros had brought back on his spacesuit bits of potato leaves. The intrepid stellar adventurer, stung to the quick by the insinuation that for 4 straight hours he had been fighting potatoes, demanded an immediate retraction of this vile calumny. The scientists, however, replied that they could not retract a single word. There was a great furor. 2 factions arose, the potatoists and the anti-potatoists, which spread first to the Big and later to the Little Dipper. The antagonists hurled dreadful epithets at one another. But this was nothing compared to what happened when the philosophers entered the fray. From England, France, Australia, Canada, and the United States they came, the most illustrious theoreticians of knowledge and expounders of pure reason, and the results of their efforts were astounding. Upon careful consideration of all sides of the issue, the physicalists maintained that when 2 bodies, A and B, move, it is a matter of indifference whether you say that A is moving in relation to B or B is moving in relation to A. Since motion is relative, one can as easily say that a man is moving in relation to a potato as say that the potato is moving in relation to the man. Therefore, the question of whether potatoes can move is meaningless, and the whole problem trivial. That is, it doesn't really exist. The sematicists maintained that everything depends on how you interpret the words potato, is, and moving. Since the key here is the operational copula is, one must examine is rigorously. Whereupon they set to work on an encyclopedia of cosmic semasiology, devoting the first 4 volumes to a discussion of the operational reference of is. The neo-positivists maintained that it is not clusters of potatoes one directly perceives, but clusters of sensory impressions. Then, employing symbolic logic, they created terms for cluster of impressions and cluster of potatoes, devised a special calculus of propositions, all in algebraic signs, and after using up several C's of ink, reached the mathematically precise and absolutely undeniable conclusion that 0 equals 0. The Thomists maintained that God had created the laws of nature for the express purpose of working miracles, since miracles constitute a violation of the laws of nature, and where there are no laws, there is nothing to violate. In the above-mentioned instance, the potatoes move if such is the will of the Almighty, though we cannot be certain that this is not some trick of accursed materialists bent on discrediting the Church. Therefore, one must await the ruling of the highest council at the Vatican. The Neo-Kantians maintained that objects are projections of the spirit, and not knowable things. If then the psyche generates the idea of a moving potato shall have existence. Yet this is but a first impression, for our spirit is no more knowable than its projections. Hence, nothing can be said either way. The holists, pluralists, behaviorists, physicalists maintained that, as is well known in physics, laws of nature operate in a statistical fashion only. Just as it is impossible to predict with complete accuracy the path of a single electron, so too you cannot know with certainty the future behavior of a single potato. Thus far, observations show that man has mashed potatoes millions of times, but it is not inconceivable that one time in a billion the situation could reverse itself, that a potato could mash a man. Professor Fustian, a solitary sage of the school of Russell and Reichenbach, subjected each of these conclusions to withering criticism. He argued that a man does not experience sensory impressions, since no one sees a sensory impression of a table, but only the table itself. And since, moreover, it is known that about the external world not a thing is known, then neither external objects nor sensory impressions exist. There is nothing, declared Professor Fustian, and anyone who thinks otherwise is wrong. Consequently, nothing can be said about potatoes, but for an altogether different reason than that given by the Neo-Kantians. While Fustian labored unremittingly, not once leaving his home, which was besieged by anti-potatoists hefting rotten potatoes, and while passions were clouding every mind, there appeared on the scene, or to be more exact, there landed on taffetum, Professor Toga. Paying no heed to the fruitless disputes, he decided to investigate the mystery sine ira et studio, as befitted a true man of science. He began his inquiry by visiting all the nearby planets, gathering information from the inhabitants. In this way he learned that the enigmatic monsters were known under the following names: Prux, Borkers, Nuffets, Gnuttles, Garugulas, Malomorps, Zops, Yachts, Batats, Rifflers, Thycandarines, Cloche, Flibbage, and Morchmel, which gave him considerable food for thought, since, according to the dictionaries, all of these names were in fact synonyms for the common potato. With amazing tenacity and indomitable fortitude, Toga worked his way to the heart of the riddle, and in 5 years had a completed theory that explained everything. Long ago, in the vicinity of Tyia, a ship carrying potatoes to the colonists on taffetum struck a meteor reef. Through a hole cut in its hull, the entire cargo tumbled out. The ship was pulled off the reef and towed by tugs to taffetum, after which the incident passed into oblivion. Meanwhile, the potatoes, having fallen under the surface of Tyia, put out shoots and began to grow as if nothing had happened. However, the conditions under which they grew were uncommonly harsh. From out of the sky, gravel rained down time and again, smashing the young sprouts and even killing whole plants. The result was such that of all the potatoes only the most alert survived, those that were able to fend for themselves and find shelter. The emerging race of perspicacious potatoes developed by leaps and bounds. After a number of generations, wearying of their sedentary way of life, they pulled up roots and took on a nomadic existence. At the same time, they completely lost the placid passivity typical of Earth's potatoes, which have been domesticated through constant care and cultivation. Growing more and more wild, they became at last potatoes of prey. There are grounds for this in their family tree. The potato, as we know, Solanum tuberosum, belongs to the nightshade family, Solanaceae, and a dog, as we know too, comes from the wolf, and if let loose in the forest, may revert. This is precisely what happened to the potatoes on Tyia. And when they began to get crowded on the planet, a new crisis ensued. The younger potatoes were fired with the need for action. They wanted to accomplish unusual things, things no vegetable had ever done before. Lifting their eyes to the heavens, they beheld there sailing slabs of stone, and resolved to settle upon them. It would take us too far afield were I to outline here the entire theory of Professor Toga, showing how first the potatoes taught themselves to fly by flapping their leaves, and how subsequently they ventured out beyond the atmosphere of Tyia, finally to establish themselves on the masses of rock that orbited the planet. Which was all the easier for them, inasmuch as, preserving their vegetable metabolism, they could remain in space indefinitely, doing without oxygen and drawing their vital energy directly from the sun's rays. In time they grew so bold as to fall upon rockets flying past the planet. Any scholar in Toga's place would have published this brilliant hypothesis and rested on his laurels, but the professor vowed not to rest until he had captured at least one predaceous potato. So then, the theoretical side of the problem having been dealt with, it was time to turn to the practical, of equal if not greater difficulty. The potatoes lurked in the crevices of large boulders, and to venture into that moving labyrinth of rushing rock in search of them would have been pure suicide. On the other hand, Toga did not intend to shoot a potato. It was a live specimen he wanted, one full of health and kicking. For a while he considered driving them from cover, but rejected that idea too as unsatisfactory. Then he hit upon a plan entirely new, which later was to win him widespread fame. He decided he would bag a potato using bait. For this purpose he purchased, in a school supply store on Taffetam, the biggest globe he could find, a beautifully painted sphere 20 feet in diameter. He also obtained a great quantity of honey, sealing wax, and fish glue, mixed this well in equal amounts, and smeared the resultant substance over the surface of the globe. He then fastened the globe to a long line from the rocket and flew off in the direction of Tyia. When he had drawn sufficiently near, the professor hid behind the corner of a nebula close by and cast the line with the bait. The whole plan hinged upon the natural curiosity of potatoes. After an hour or so, a light vibration indicated that something was approaching. Carefully peering out, Toga observed several potatoes shaking their leaves and tentatively shifting their tubers as they made their way towards the globe. Apparently they took it for some unknown planet. After a while they gathered up courage and squatted on the globe, sticking to its surface. The professor quickly drew in his line, attached it to the tail of the rocket, and headed back to Taffetam. It is difficult to picture the enthusiasm with which the dauntless scholar was received. The captured potatoes, globe and all, were thrown into a cage and put on public display. Furious and wild with fear, the potatoes flailed the air with their leaves and stamped their roots, but obviously this got them nowhere. When, on the following day, the College of Sciences went to Toga in order to present him with an honorary degree and a heavy medal of esteem, the professor was gone. Having crowned his efforts with success, he had set off in the night, destination unknown. The reason for his sudden departure is well known to me. Toga hurried because in 9 days he was supposed to meet me on Corulia. I myself was at the same time speeding towards the appointed planet from the opposite end of the Milky Way. We intended to set out together for a still unexplored arm of the galaxy, which extended out beyond a dark nebula in Orion. The professor and I were not yet personally acquainted. Desiring to earn the reputation of a man true to his word and punctual, I squeezed all the power I could out of the engine, but alas, as it so often happens when we're in a particular hurry, an unforeseen accident ruined my plans. Some tiny meteor or other punctured the fuel tank and, lodging itself in the exhaust pipe, cut the motor dead. With a sigh, I put on my spacesuit, picked up a strong flashlight and the tools, then left the cabin and went outside. While extracting the meteor with a pair of pliers, I inadvertently knocked the flashlight, which drifted off a considerable distance and began independently to sail through space. I plugged the hole in the tank and returned to the cabin. I couldn't chase after the flashlight, having lost practically my entire supply of fuel. As it was, I barely made it to the nearest planet, Procyon. The Procyon are intelligent beings and very much like us. The one difference, unimportant really, lies in the fact that they have legs only to the knee. Lower down is a wheel, not artificial but forming a part of the body. They move about with great speed and grace, like acrobats on unicycles. Their knowledge is extensive. Astronomy in particular excites them. Stargazing is, in fact, so widespread that no one, young or old, goes anywhere without a hand telescope. Sundials are used exclusively, and pulling out a mechanical timepiece in public constitutes a serious breach of conduct. The Procyon also have a number of civilizing devices. I recall how, the first time I visited them, I attended a banquet in honor of old Meritilitek, their famous astronomer. At one point I got into a discussion with him about some issue in astronomy. The professor disagreed with me. Our conversation grew sharper and sharper in tone. Then the old man glared, and it looked as if he would explode any moment. Suddenly he jumped up and rushed from the hall. After 5 minutes he returned and sat down beside me, pleasant, smiling, as placid as a child. Intrigued, I asked later what had caused this magical transformation of mood. "What?" said the Procyon I'd approached. "You really don't know? The professor used the steam room." "The steam room?" "The name of the device from the expression, to blow off steam. A person seized with anger or feeling hostility towards someone enters a small chamber padded with cork and there gives vent to his emotions." This time when I landed on Procyon, I saw, from the air, crowds of people marching in the streets. They were waving lanterns and cheering. Leaving my rocket to the care of the mechanics, I went on to the city. As I soon learned, they were all celebrating the discovery of a new star which had appeared in the sky the night before. This made me think, and when after a warm welcome Meritilitek invited me to his powerful refractor, as soon as I put my eye to the lens, I realized that the star in question was only my flashlight sailing through space. Instead of telling the Procytes, however, I decided, somewhat frivolously, to play at being a better astronomer than they, and making a quick calculation in my head as to how long the flashlight batteries would last, announced to those assembled that the new star would shine white for 6 hours, then turn yellow, red, and finally go out altogether. This prediction met with general disbelief, and Meratilitek, with his customary hot-headedness, exclaimed that if that happened he would eat his beard. The star began to dim at the time foretold by me, and that evening, when I showed up at the observatory, I found a group of crestfallen assistants who informed me that Meratilitek, wounded in his pride, had shut himself up in the study, there to carry out the promise he had so rashly given. Fearing that this might cause him some injury, I tried to reason with him through the door, but to no avail. I put my ear to the keyhole and heard a rustling that confirmed the words of the assistants. In the greatest agitation, I wrote a letter explaining everything, gave it to the assistants, with the request that they hand it over to the professor immediately following my departure, whereupon I ran to the airport as fast as my legs could carry me. I did this because I wasn't sure whether or not the professor would be able, before confronting me, to use the steam room. I left Procyon at 1 in the morning in such haste I completely forgot about the fuel. 1,000,000 miles or so out, the tanks ran dry, and I became a cosmic castaway on a ship adrift in space. Only 3 days remained till the time of my rendezvous with Toga. Corulia was perfectly visible through the window, glowing at a distance of barely 300 million miles, but all I could do was look at it in helpless rage. Yes, the most trifling events can sometimes have tremendous consequences. For want of a nail. About an hour later, I noticed a planet slowly looming larger. The ship, yielding passively to its pull, began to pick up speed, till finally it was plummeting like a stone. Determined to make the best of a bad business, I took my seat at the controls. The planet was rather small, desolate, yet homey. I observed oases heated volcanically and with running water. There were plenty of volcanoes. They belched fire and columns of smoke continually. Now I hurtled through the atmosphere, maneuvering the rudders, trying everything I could to decrease velocity, but that merely postponed the moment of impact. And then, flying over a range of volcanoes, I got an idea. After a moment's thought, I reached a desperate decision, and directing the nose of my craft downwards, like a thunderbolt, plunged straight into the gaping mouth of the largest volcano. At the last minute, when those red-hot jaws had already engulfed me, with a skillful flip of the rudder, I turned the rocket around, nose upward, and in this position sank into that bottomless pit of roaring lava. Risky, but there was no other way. I hoped that the volcano, stirred by the violent blow of the rocket, would react with an eruption, and I was not disappointed. A blast of thunder shook the walls, and in a column of flame, lava, ash, and smoke that rose for many miles, I flew up and out into the sky. I steered in order to fall on course straight for Corulia, and succeeded perfectly. 3 days later, I was at my destination, and only 20 minutes late. But I didn't find Toga there. He had taken off, leaving me a letter held at the post office. "Dear colleague," he wrote, "circumstances impel me to set out at once. Therefore I propose that we meet in the heart of the unexplored region. Since chorographical stars have no names, I'll give you directions. Fly straight ahead, turn left at the blue sun, then right at the next, orange. There you'll find 4 planets. I'll be on the 3rd from the left. Looking forward to meeting you. Sincerely yours, Toga." Fueling up, I blasted off at dusk. The trip took 1 week, and when I entered the unknown territory, I found the right stars without any trouble. Carefully following the professor's instructions, on the morning of the 8th day I saw the designated planet. This massive globe was covered with thick green fur, which turned out to be a gigantic tropical rainforest. The sight of it disconcerted me somewhat, for I had no idea how to go about locating Toga. However, I counted on his ingenuity, and was not mistaken. Flying straight for the planet, at 11 that morning, I noticed on its northern hemisphere certain faint lines that took my breath away. I always say to young, inexperienced astronauts, don't believe it if someone tells you he approached a planet and saw its name written on it. That's an old cosmic joke. This time, however, I was at a loss, for there across the green woodland clearly stood the inscription, "Couldn't wait. See you at next planet. Toga." The letters were each a mile in size. Otherwise, of course, I wouldn't have spotted them. Thoroughly amazed, and also curious as to how the professor had drawn that giant sign, I flew closer. Then I saw that the lines of the letters were wide avenues of level, trampled trees, distinctly separate from the untouched areas. Still mystified, I did as the sign said and hurried on to the next planet, which was inhabited and civilized. At sunset, I reached the airport. In vain did I inquire there after Toga. This time, too, there was a letter waiting for me. "Dear colleague, my deepest apologies for letting you down like this, but in connection with a certain family matter that will not brook delay, I must, alas, go home at once. To lessen your disappointment, I am leaving a package at the main office. Kindly claim it. It contains the fruits of my latest research. You are undoubtedly curious as to how on the previous planet I left you that written message. It was really quite simple. That globe is going through an epoch corresponding to the Carboniferous on Earth, and is populated by giant lizards, including terrible Atlantosaurs, 150 feet long. Having landed on the planet, I crept up to a great herd of Atlantosaurs and provoked them until they attacked me. I began then to run quickly through the forest in a calculated way, such that the trail of my flight would assume the shape of letters, and the herd charging after me mowed down all the trees. Thus were produced those avenues 250 feet in diameter. Quite simple, as I said, but rather fatiguing, in that I was obliged to run nearly 30 miles, and at a rapid clip besides. I sincerely regret that this time, too, we cannot make one another's acquaintance. Let me then shake your intrepid hand, and offer expressions of the highest regard for your many virtues and courage. Toga. P.S. I strongly recommend you take in the concert at the city this evening. It's excellent. T. I picked up the package set aside for me at the airport office, ordered it delivered to the hotel, and myself went on to the city. It presented a most unusual sight. The planet spins with such velocity that day alternates with night there every hour. Due to the centrifugal force produced by this, a freely hanging plumb line is not perpendicular to the ground, as on Earth, but rather makes an angle of 45 degrees with it. All the houses, towers, walls, in general every sort of edifice, stands leaning towards the surface of the ground at a 45-degree angle, which affords a somewhat peculiar sight to the human eye. The houses on one side of the street appear to be bending over backwards, while on the other side they lean and hang above the first. The planet's inhabitants, in order not to fall, possess through natural adaptation one short leg and one long. A man, however, when walking, must constantly bend one knee, which after a certain time becomes extremely difficult and painful. Therefore I proceeded slowly, so that by the time I reached the building where they were supposed to hold the concert, the doors to the hall were being closed. I hurriedly bought a ticket and ran inside. Hardly had I taken my seat when the conductor rapped with his baton and everyone fell silent. The members of the orchestra began to move with energy, playing on instruments I'd never seen before, horns with perforated funnels similar to showerheads. The conductor now lifted both his front extremities with feeling, now spread them out as if calling for pianissimo, but my amazement only grew, for so far I had heard not a single sound. Casting a furtive glance on either side, I saw ecstasy written on the faces of my neighbors. More and more bewildered and uneasy, I tried discreetly cleaning out my ears, but with no result. Finally, afraid that I had lost my hearing, I quietly tapped my fingernails together. However, this faint sound was distinctly audible. So then, not knowing what to think of this, perplexed by the general signs of aesthetic satisfaction, I sat through to the end of the work. A burst of applause rang out. The conductor gave a bow, once again rapped his baton, and the orchestra proceeded to the next movement of the symphony. All around, people were entranced. I heard a great deal of sniffing, and took this as an indication of deep emotion. Then at last came the stormy finale, or so I assumed, judging by the violent exertion of the conductor and the beads of sweat that formed on the brows of the musicians. Again, thunderous applause. My neighbor turned to me, expressing his admiration for the symphony and its performance. I muttered something in reply, and fled out onto the street in complete confusion. I had already walked a few dozen steps away from the building, when something made me turn and look at its facade. Like the others, it was inclined at a sharp angle to the street. Over the entrance loomed a sign that said Municipal Olfactorium, and below were printed program posters on which I read Odontron, the Musk Symphony, 1. Preludium Odoratum, 2. Allegro Aromatoso, 3. Andante Olens, featuring as guest conductor in a rare appearance the famous nasalist Hranter. With a curse, I turned on my heel and made straight for the hotel. I didn't blame Toga for my failure to enjoy the concert. He had no way of knowing that I was still suffering from the cold I'd caught on Satellite. To make up the disappointment to myself, immediately after arriving at the hotel, I unpacked my package. It contained a movie projector, a reel of film, and a letter that went as follows. My dear colleague, you will recall our telephone conversation when you were visiting the Little and I the Big Dipper. I said at the time that I suspected the existence of beings able to live at high temperatures on hot, molten planets, and that I intended to do research in this direction. You saw fit to express your doubt that such an undertaking would succeed. Well, here you have the proof before you. I selected a fiery planet, approached it by rocket as near as possible, then lowered on a long asbestos rope a fireproof filming device and microphone. In this fashion I took a number of interesting shots. The results of this little experiment I am taking the liberty of enclosing herewith. Yours, Toga. burning with curiosity. No sooner had I finished reading than I put the film in the machine, hung my bedsheet up over the door, and, turning off the light, started the projector. At first, on that improvised screen, there were only flickering patches of color. I heard hoarse noises and a crackling as if of logs in a furnace. Then the picture sharpened. The sun was sinking beneath the horizon. The surface of the ocean quivered. Across it flitted tiny blue flames. The fiery clouds grew pale in the gathering darkness. The first faint stars appeared. Young Rodrillo, weary after studying all day, had just emerged from his fludget to take an evening stroll. There was nowhere in particular he was going. Leisurely, moving his twoons, he inhaled with pleasure the fresh, fragrant vapors of burning ammonia. Someone approached him, barely visible in the growing dusk. Rodrillo strained his scrotchers, but it wasn't until the other came nigh that the youth recognized his friend. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" said Rodrillo. The friend shifted his weight from ambus to ambus, leaned halfway out of the fire, and said, "Lovely indeed. The sal ammoniac has grown nicely this year, have you noticed?" "Yes, the harvest promises to be good." Rodrillo swayed lazily, turned over on his belly, and, opening all his opticals, gazed up at the stars. "You know," he said after a moment, "whenever I look at the night sky, as now, I cannot help but feel that, up there, far, far away, are other worlds, worlds similar to our own, and also inhabited by beings of intelligence." "Who speaks here of intelligence?" came a voice nearby. Both lads turned their backs in that direction to see who it was. They recognized the gnarled but still spry figure of Flamentius. That hoary scholar approached them with stately motions, and his future descendants, looking like bunches of grapes, were already swelling and sending out their first shoots on his spreading shoulders. "I was speaking of the intelligent beings that inhabit other worlds," replied Rodrillo, lifting his squips respectfully. "Rodrillo was speaking of intelligent beings on other worlds," rejoined the scholar. "Just look at him. Other worlds yet. Ah, that Rodrillo, that Rodrillo. Is this how you spend your time, my boy, letting your imagination run wild? But of course, I approve. On an evening such as this, it's gotten definitely colder, don't you think?" "No," said both lads together. "The fires of youth, yes, I know. All the same, it's now only 860 degrees. I should have put on my lava-lined pullover. That's old age for you. So you say," he continued, turning his back to Rodrillo, "that on other worlds there exists intelligent life? What sort of creatures are these, according to you?" "We cannot know exactly," replied the youth timidly. "They are varied, I think. It's conceivable even that on the cooler planets living organisms might arise from a substance called protein." "Who told you that?" Flamentius burst out in anger. "Implosio. He's the young student of biochemistry who—" "Young fool, you mean," snapped Flamentius. "Life from protein? Living things from protein? Aren't you ashamed to spout such nonsense in the presence of your teacher? Here is the result of the ignorance and the arrogance that have spread so alarmingly of late. You know what they ought to do with that Implosio of yours. Give him a good watering down, that's what." "But Flamentius, sir," ventured Rodrillo's friend, "why demand such severe punishment for Implosio? Couldn't you tell us what beings on other planets might look like? Might they not stand erect and move on things called legs?" "Where did you hear that?" Rodrillo said nothing, frightened. "From Implosio," whispered his friend. "Enough, for heaven's sake, enough of this Implosio and his fabrications," shouted the scholar. "Legs? Really? As if I hadn't only 25 blazes ago proven mathematically that a 2-footed being, as soon as one stood it up, would immediately fall flat on its face? I even constructed an appropriate model and diagrams, but what would you, sluggards, know of that? What do intelligent beings on other worlds look like? I'm not going to tell you straight out. Think a little. Learn to use your minds. First, they'll have to have organs to take in ammonia, right? And what can do this better than the twoons? And won't they have to move through a medium as resistant and as warm as ours? Well, won't they? Of course they will. And how can you do this if not with ambuses? Also, they will probably form sense organs, opticals, nims, blowfibs. And of course, must be like us pentoids, not merely in physical structure, but in the overall manner of living. Everyone knows, surely, that the pentex is the basic unit of our family life. Try in your imagination to picture something different. Exert your fancy as much as you wish. I promise you that you will fail. Yes, because in order to start a family, in order to produce progeny, one has to have a tata, a gaga, a mama, a fafa, and a haha. Mutual affection, plans, hopes, and dreams, they are nothing if you lack a member of any one of these 5 genders, a situation which unfortunately does sometimes happen in life. We call it the tragic quadrangle, or unrequited love. And so you see, by reasoning without prejudice or preconceptions, by relying solely on the scientific facts, by employing the precise tool of logic, proceeding coldly and objectively, we reach the inescapable conclusion that every intelligent being